My last video was the culmination of my series ranking FromSoft bosses from worst to best, and saw my complete list of my favourite and least favourite fights in the Soulsborne roster, but today I'm going to break it down game by game and determine which has the highest quality of bosses. Of course I'm basing this on how the fights of each entry ranked in my complete Souls boss ranking, which is my personal preference on an ultimately subjective medium. I assigned a number of points to each tier and gathered some data accordingly, but there's so many more nuances to a game's boss quality than mere scores that this method doesn't account for. So I'll still be ranking these games based on my overall thoughts on their rosters, but I will show you the data where relevant so you can see how they all stack up in my books. As I said, this list is simply my opinion, and while I encourage you to share yours in the comments, please keep it respectful. All that aside, let's start with the Soulsborne title I consider to have the weakest lineup of bosses. It shouldn't really be all that surprising that the first entry in the series claims the bottom spot. FromSoftware really haven't found their footing with the bosses in this game, and many of them rely on gimmicky designs more akin to the bosses of classic video games. This does result in all the fights feeling really unique, but as far as their mechanical depth goes, they just don't hold up to later games. There's some pretty poor fights here, like Fool's Idol or the incredibly broken Man-Eaters. Even the best it has to offer only reach the upper middle end of my ranking, with Penetrator sitting all the way down in the good tier. For comparison, Dark Souls 2's best boss is weaker than the best bosses of every other game besides Demon Souls, but the Fume Knight is an entire tier, almost 2 above Penetrator. Demon Souls just wasn't as polished as later Souls games, and it shows in its bosses. It's easily the weakest of them all, with an unremarkable boss roster to match. Night Rain does have some really good fights. Caligo placed almost as high on my list as the Penetrator, Animus climbed even higher, and Hyolstor far overshadows Demon Souls' best boss. There's some other solid fights in the rankings like Libra, Folgore, and Gladius, but bosses like Adele and Maris really drag the roster down. Other games certainly have far worse bosses than Night Rain, but typically they also have more great fights. One of the biggest issues comes with the Everdark Sovereigns. While they're a great concept and help you keep playing this game for much longer, their execution was incredibly flawed. Noster, Folgore, and Gladius are improved by their enhanced variants, but Libra, Adele, Maris, and Caligo all become weaker fights in the Everdark versions. Ultimately, they end up weakening Night Rain's boss roster slightly. There's also the abysmal fight against the Revenant if you do the Remembrance quests, which really doesn't help the newest Souls game. And yes, Night Rain really isn't a Souls game. Including it on this list is a little unfair given how far removed it is from the rest of the series, but I wanted to talk about it anyway. I also tallied up the points when including the unique night bosses it added, such as Wormface and Company or the Smelter Demon. All those I included in my complete boss ranking. It ended up getting a notably lower cumulative score than without, though the average remained the same. Night Rain's cumulative boss score actually proved higher than that of Dark Souls 1, since it's a much more consistent level of quality, but the highs are incredibly limited by virtue of the small boss roster, and while it doesn't have nearly as many terrible bosses as games like Dark Souls or Dark Souls 2, it just doesn't have as many great bosses either. I'm sure this is a game many people would place at the bottom of their ranking, and sure, it's got plenty of awful fights. The Royal Rat Authority is the runner-up for being FromSoft's worst boss. It tied with Demon Souls for average score, and was the lowest ranking game with all points added together, but there's actually a surprising amount of good bosses in Dark Souls 2, likely more than you'd think. Fume Knight, Seralon, both Smelter Demons, Looking Glass Knight, the Pursuer, Old Dragon Slayer, Lost Sinner, Burnt Ivory King, Velstadt, the list even keeps going on. It ends up having far more positives than Night Rain or Demon Souls, and while I don't think Fume Knight compares to most of the peaks of other games in the series, he's still an excellent encounter. In a game with the sheer volume of bosses DS2 delivers, there's bound to be plenty of enjoyable encounters. Unfortunately, there's many bad ones to match, but everyone seems to give the next game on our list a pass for having loads of awful bosses. Why not DS2? It's far from a star-studded roster, but I do think at the end of the day I prefer it to the couple below. If we purely look at the numbers, sure, it's the worst, but I don't think that ranking system truly captures all the nuances of the catalog's quality. Sure to be a contentious pick given how beloved the original Dark Souls is. I personally think its boss quality is middle of the road. It has some great ones for sure, Artorias, ONS and Calamite being standouts. Quailag, Manus and Bell Gargoyles are also really solid. What drags Dark Souls 1 down is the sheer amount of terrible bosses in this game. Nito, Bed of Chaos, Seath, Pinwheel, Capra Demon, Stray Demon, Ceaseless Discharge, Centipede Demon. That's 8 bosses in the trash tier. Then you get to the likes of Demon Fire Sage and Moonlight Butterfly, who aren't much better. I'd say around half this game's bosses are just plain poor, which is actually a pretty similar ratio of good to bad as Dark Souls 2. I do think Dark Souls hits higher highs, but it also has more numerous lows, so while I think it's clearly superior to the sequel in this category, it's not by a vast amount. If we don't include Night Rain's minor bosses, it actually outranks Dark Souls with a cumulative score of 0 opposed to DS1's -2. They both achieve an average score of 0, which only adds credence to my placement of one of gaming's most important games. Much like Dark Souls 1, placing everyone's precious Bloodborne this low will definitely get me in hot water. I'm sure nobody will be disrespectful when disagreeing with me in the comments. Bloodborne has some of the best bosses in the series. Maria, Ludwig and Gascoigne are all in my top 15. Gehrman, Orphan and Lawrence are great as well, and the Cleric Beast is a solid introductory boss. Unfortunately, after them, the roster falls off drastically. There's a couple of decent bosses like Logarius and Amygdala, but much like DS1, this game has its share of bosses in the low tiers. Mikolash, Rom, One Reborn, Living Failures, Moon Presence. Between the shadows of Yharnam and Gehrman, you don't get to fight a good boss in the main progression. It's nowhere near as bad as Dark Souls' second half, but Bloodborne has that same issue and nobody ever acknowledges it. If we add the Chalice bosses to the mix, Bloodborne's score actually doesn't change much, going from a 7 to a 6. The dungeons don't bring any incredible fights, but most of them are actually pretty decent. It's just the black sheep at the bottom of the pack that harm this game so significantly. Still, it has the highest cumulative score yet, and ties DS1 and Night Rain at an average boss score of 0. If the last two picks weren't controversial enough for you, this one definitely will be. The community has been divided on Elden Ring's bosses since the game released, and while I'm on the side that likes the direction they took them, I still don't think it always executes it perfectly. It has more bosses in the highest tiers than any other, with fights like Messmer, R'hllana and Malekith, but that's by virtue of its boss roster being so vast, and this also means there's plenty in the low tiers. Even so, its major bosses never reach the lows of Dark Souls or Bloodborne. Godskin Duo and the full-grown Falling Star Beast are nowhere close to as bad as Nito or One Reborn. If we take the minor bosses into account, the cumulative score drops from 14, the highest in the series so far, all the way down to negative 72. When tallying the marks, there were just so many mini-bosses in the mediocre tier that the score kept getting dropped by 1 point over and over. That's not even to mention the worst boss in the series, the Deathblight Beast of Holy Jank. But I don't think it's really fair to count the minor bosses as part of the primary roster, even if we do. Aside from a few instances, they don't detract from my experience with the game, so can I truly consider them as a weakness when I enjoy a lot of these lesser fights like Daravil and Patches? Again, there's the issues with the numeric ranking system. It just doesn't do the rosters justice. So for the great number of really strong to incredible fights in Elden Ring, and the lack of lows in comparison to the games we've covered so far, Elden Ring climbs its way into my top 3. I know, in a couple of my videos I said I considered Dark Souls 3 to have the best boss roster in the series. Give me a couple months, I'm sure my opinion will change again and this game will be back on top, but just know it's incredibly close to being number 1. Dark Souls 3's quantity of great bosses is only matched by Elden Ring, and the roster's about half the size. It has a couple of terrible bosses, sure, but Curse-Rotted Greatwood and Ancient Wyvern don't exactly compare to the Bed of Chaos, do they? And I'd say Wolnir and Deacons are more in line with the likes of Moonlight Butterfly, where they're bad, but not a crime against humanity. But DS3 more than makes up for that with all the amazing bosses. Nameless King, Demon Princes, Dark Eater Madeira and Champion Gundit all missed out on my top 10 for this game's boss ranking. That's insane. Bosses of that caliber would easily be top 5 in Dark Souls 1. Slave Knight Gale, Twin Princes, Dancer, Freed, Soul of Cinder, Abyss Watchers, Udex Gundyr, Pontiff Sullivan, Dragon Slayer Armor. None of the other games aside from our number 1 can really claim to have that level of consistently incredible gameplay in their boss fights. Sure, Dark Souls 3 doesn't have all that much variety, with most of its bosses falling under the banner of Big Knight with Big Weapon, but should we really complain when that's so blatantly the best style of boss FromSoft makes? Look at the best bosses in their other games. Penetrator, Artorias, Fume Knight, Maria, Ishin, Messmer, Hyolsor. Notice the trend? DS3's cumulative scores clearly overshadows every other game so far, being an entire 8 points higher than that of Elden Ring's, and it gains an average score of 1, only matched by the game I have above it. Dark Souls 3 is the only game to have 2 bosses in my top tier, being Gale and Twin Princes, and Slave Knight Gale is in my eyes the greatest video game boss ever made. I've watched so many other boss rankings on YouTube, and the vast majority have Gale in Soulsborne's top 10, with many placing him at the top spot as I did. The final game in the Dark Souls trilogy really perfected the art of boss design, and while it still has some classic FromSoft fumbles I can't understand, it's clearly one of the strongest rosters of any video game. But when tallying scores and considering my ranking for this video, I realised there was one that provides a slightly more consistent level of high quality across the board. I'm honestly surprised Sekiro took the top spot, but its bosses are just so consistently well designed in every aspect. The worst boss in this game, the Headless Ape Duo, isn't even in the bottom 50 in the series. It's 2 tiers up from the bottom, and ahead of that, there's only 2 bosses in the mediocre tier. Everything else is at least decent, most is good or better. And then there's fights like Genichiro and Ishin who stand out as crowning achievements of FromSoft boss design. Sekiro tied Dark Souls 3's average score, and even surpassed its cumulative with 28 to DS3's 22. While I don't think Sekiro hits as many crazy crazy highs as Dark Souls 3. Ishin is a very close contender for Gale's position as best boss in the series, and Sekiro's lows also just simply don't compare to those of other games in the series. That goes for the entire game, not just the bosses. I didn't expect this to be the gold medalist in our ranking of the games by boss quality, but I think it's pretty unarguable that Sekiro's consistency just can't be matched. There's my list of every Soulsborne title ranked by their boss quality. I'm sure you'll disagree with some of my placements, and you're free to voice that disagreement in the comments if you do so respectfully. As always, if you enjoyed, liking and subscribing goes a really long way. I appreciate those of you who took time out of your days to watch through this video, and hopefully you'll stick around to catch my next one.